There is a kind of man who believes the room belongs to him before he ever walks into it. You have seen him before. He moves slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he has never once been told to stop. He does not check whether others are watching. He does not adjust himself for anyone. He carries himself with the settled ease of a person who has concluded some time long ago that the rules exist to manage other people. His name was Wade Pruitt, Officer Wade Pruitt, Keller County Police Department, Georgia. 18 years on the force, 38 formal complaints, 0 disciplinary actions, 3 promotions. On the morning of October the 14th, Wade Pruitt walked into Courtroom 7B of the Keller County Courthouse wearing his full dress uniform. Polished badge, pressed collar, shoes that caught the courtroom light when he walked. The slow, deliberate walk of a man who had never once had to answer for anything. He had appeared in courtrooms before, always as a witness, always on the side of the prosecution, always with the weight of the department behind him like a wall at his back. This morning was different. This morning he was the defendant. But Wade Pruitt did not carry himself like a defendant. He carried himself the way he always had, like the room owed him something, like the proceedings were a formality, a performance staged by people with too much education and too little understanding of how the world actually worked. He settled into his chair at the defense table and looked around the room. He looked at the gallery briefly the way a person looks at furniture. He looked at his attorney, Frank Stull, a career police union lawyer with thinning hair and a briefcase worn soft at the corners from too many years of this exact kind of mourning. Stull had a stack of papers in front of him and was moving through them with the focused efficiency of a man trying to stay ahead of something. Then Pruitt looked at the bench, empty for now, elevated. A single high-backed chair behind a wide surface of dark oak polished to a deep shine. 2 cameras mounted in the upper corners of the room that he acknowledged with a single bored glance and immediately dismissed. He had been in courtrooms like this a dozen times. He knew how they worked. He knew who won and who lost. And he knew in the quiet interior certainty that 18 years of impunity tends to produce which category he belonged to. He did not know about the cameras, not in any meaningful way. He had looked at them, but he had not seen them. They had been upgraded 3 months earlier, part of a courthouse security modernization funded by a state grant. High definition, wide angle, audio capture at a clarity that made the old system look like a toy. He did not know that the court reporter seated at her small machine near the witness stand recorded every syllable spoken in that room, including the ones spoken in whispers, including the ones the speaker did not intend to be on record. He did not know that the woman who was about to sit in that elevated chair had spent the last 6 weeks reading his file. All of it. Every one of the 38 complaints. The ones that had been dismissed. The ones that had been returned for revision. The one that had disappeared entirely from the file and been recovered from an archive scan by a sergeant in internal affairs who had spent 27 years watching things like that happen and had finally quietly decided to start keeping copies. He did not know that she had done something no one else in 18 years had bothered to do. She had filed a federal records request to obtain the full complaint history that his department had twice told her was unavailable. She had filed it herself, on her own time, through a process that took 4 weeks and 2 follow-up letters, and it had arrived in a manila envelope thick enough to make the mail clerk raise an eyebrow. She had read every page more than once. Naomi Carter arrived at the courthouse before anyone else that morning. She came in through the side entrance, the one that connected directly to the judicial wing, the one that allowed her to walk straight to her chambers without passing through the lobby or the security line or the television cameras that had set up on the courthouse steps 2 days earlier when the case was first reported in the Atlanta papers. She was 52 years old. She had a face that had been described in various newspaper profiles over the years as composed, which was accurate but incomplete. Composed suggested effort, suggested the deliberate suppression of something that wanted to come through. What Naomi Carter had was something older and harder than effort. It was the practiced stillness of a woman who had learned in places far more dangerous than any courtroom that showing your reaction was the same as giving away your position. 8 years in the United States Army Judge Advocate General Corps, legal advisor. She had been deployed once to a forward operating base in a country where the summer heat bent the air above the pavement, and the legal questions that came across her desk involved decisions that would affect whether specific people lived or died. She had conducted cross-examinations in field tents and military tribunals across tables from men who believed that if they said something with enough force and enough certainty, it became true regardless of the evidence. She had learned in that environment that the most dangerous men were not the ones who shouted. The most dangerous men were the ones who had never been contradicted. The ones who had moved through their entire professional lives without once having to absorb the consequence of being wrong. She recognized that type. She recognized it the moment she opened Pruitt's file. Not because she knew him personally, because she knew the pattern, the same certainty, the same escalation, the same belief that the rules were for other people. She sat in her chambers that morning with the manila folder open on her desk, and she went through it one final time. Not because she had forgotten anything. She had not forgotten anything. She went through it because she needed to carry the full weight of it into the room. One complaint stood out more than the others, not because it was the worst, though it was among the worst, but because of a single paragraph in the middle of a thin 1.5-page report. A young man named Darius Okafor, 24 years old, nursing student at Keller County Community College 3 semesters from graduation. Stopped for a broken tail light on a Tuesday night at 11:47 in the evening 3 miles from his apartment. His statement was a single paragraph, added at the bottom of a complaint form by an internal affairs officer who appeared to have spent no more than 20 minutes on the case. The handwriting was rushed. The paragraph ended mid-thought. Naomi read it slowly. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, word by word. Then she closed the folder. She set both palms on top of it for a moment. Then she stood. She put on her robe. She walked down the corridor toward the courtroom. She pushed open the door. She took her seat, and she waited for the room to fill. The gallery filled quickly that morning. Journalists took their positions along the wall, notebooks and recorders at the ready. A row of courthouse regulars settled into their preferred seats with the practiced efficiency of people who had seen many cases begin and knew better than to expect any of them to be ordinary. In the front row, a woman sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She had come in before the gallery officially opened and had asked the security officer at the door quietly whether she was allowed to sit in the front. He had said yes. She sat down, and she had not moved since. Her name was Loretta Okafor. She was 51 years old. She worked 2 jobs. Had worked 2 jobs since Darius was 7 years old, when his father left and did not come back. And she had looked at her son and decided that every single thing after that moment was going to be for him. She was wearing her church dress, navy blue with a small white collar. Her gloves were folded in her lap. Beside her sat a woman from her congregation, someone who had driven her there and would drive her home whichever direction the day ended up going. 3 rows behind them, a cluster of uniformed officers from the Keller County Police Department had taken seats along the right side of the gallery. They had not been invited by the court. They had come on their own initiative. They sat with arms crossed and faces arranged into expressions of careful neutrality the way men sit when they want to be visible without appearing to be making a statement. Naomi noticed them the moment she took her seat. She noticed the way Pruitt glanced at them and the way something in his posture settled when he did. She did not comment. She filed it. Frank Stoll made a final adjustment to his papers. He leaned toward Pruitt and said something low. Pruitt ignored him. Pruitt was looking at the gallery, at the officers. He thought he was looking at a room that would protect him. He had spent 18 years in a room like that. He did not understand that this room was different. He did not understand that the room was tired. Idie Claire Morrow opened for the state. She was in her mid-40s, lean and precise, in a way that suggested she had removed every unnecessary thing from her life in order to be very good at this one thing. She did not use notes. She had internalized the case so thoroughly that notes would have slowed her down. She stood at the podium and she began. She said that on the night of March the 22nd, Officer Wade Pruitt had initiated a traffic stop without calling it in to dispatch, without running the plate, and without any documented probable cause beyond a broken tail light reported by no one. She said that within 9 minutes of that stop, Darius Okafor, who had kept his hands visible throughout, who had complied with every instruction, who had asked only one question, which was, what did he do wrong? Was lying on the wet pavement of Canfield Avenue with 2 fractured ribs, a fractured right wrist, a dislocated left shoulder, and contusions along his jaw that would take 3 weeks to fade. She said that Officer Pruitt's body camera had malfunctioned that night. She let the words sit for a moment before she continued. She said that Officer Delgado's body camera had also been off. She said that a dashcam mounted in Delgado's vehicle, however, had not been turned off. She said that the state would present what that dashcam had recorded. Then she returned to her seat. Stoll rose. He straightened his jacket, and his expression simultaneously the reflex of a man who had done this many times. He said that policing was not conducted from the safety of a courtroom. He said that decisions were made in seconds under pressure in situations where danger did not announce itself politely. He said that Officer Pruitt had served this community for 18 years, had answered calls that most civilians would turn and walk away from, and had made a decision on the night in question, based on training and threat perception that he had developed over nearly 2 decades of experience. He said the state was asking the court to evaluate a split-second decision, with the luxury of hindsight. Pruitt's chin lifted slightly. He was feeding on those words. Stoll continued building toward his central argument when Pruitt leaned forward and whispered a correction. A specific factual correction about the timeline. Stoll stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tightened by a fraction. He incorporated the correction and continued. Naomi watched that exchange the way she watched many things in that room, with attention, without expression. When Stoll finished, she looked at the defense table. Pruitt met her eyes and gave a slow nod. Not a nod of deference. The kind of nod a man gives when he has decided someone is decorative. When he has concluded before the proceedings have properly begun that the person sitting in judgment has no real power over him. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to the prosecution table. She said, "Call your first witness." Officer Pete Delgado had the face of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had only recently been allowed to set it down, and was not entirely sure yet what to do with his hands now that they were empty. He was 36 years old. He walked to the witness stand carefully. His uniform was pressed and clean. His eyes moved between the floor and the middle distance, avoiding the defense table. He had been Pruitt's partner for 4 years. 4 years of signing reports, 4 years of looking away, 4 years of telling himself that what he was doing was not quite what it was, that it was loyalty and pragmatism and the necessary compromises of working with a difficult man on difficult streets. He had walked into the Internal Affairs office 11 days ago and asked very quietly whether he could speak to someone. He had asked for protection before he said a single word. They had given it to him. Claire Morrow approached the stand without hurry. She asked him to describe the night of March the 22nd. Delgado described it the way you describe something you have replayed too many times, something that has worn itself smooth in the telling even as it remains sharp underneath. He described their shift. He described the traffic stop. He described the way Pruitt's voice changed the moment Darius stepped out of the car. It dropped from procedural into something else, something personal and cold, something that had nothing to do with a broken tail light. He described what happened next without flinching. The commands, the hands visible, the compliance. And then Pruitt's hands on Darius, not because Darius had done anything, but because Pruitt had decided. He described the first blow. He described the sound of it. He described Darius going down. And then he described the second blow. The one that came after Darius was already on the ground. Already still. Hands no longer moving, voice barely audible. The second blow. Morrow asked him what he had done when he saw that. Delgado looked at his hands. He said he had looked away. He said he knew it was wrong. He said he knew in the moment that it was wrong, and he said nothing and did nothing because he understood from 4 years of working alongside this man exactly what happened to people who said something. Morrow asked him to explain what he meant by that. Delgado took a slow breath. He talked about a woman named Denise Carter, who had filed a complaint against Pruitt 2 years earlier. He said that after she filed, patrol cars from Pruitt's unit began appearing in front of her house. Not for any documented reason, not for any dispatch call, just there, idling, night after night for 2 weeks. She withdrew the complaint. He talked about a man who had reported an unlawful stop and began finding parking tickets on his car every morning. Different officer each time. Different violation. But every morning without fail a ticket. He said everyone on the force knew how Pruitt handled people who created problems for him. They just called it something else. They had a language for it that made it sound like professional culture rather than what it was. He said he signed the report that night because he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't. He said he had been afraid for 4 years. He said he was still afraid. He said the difference was that now the fear was of a different thing. Stull rose for cross-examination. He was deliberate. He framed his questions carefully. He asked why Delgado had come forward now after years of silence, after signing the report, after allowing Darius Okafor to be charged with resisting arrest based on a report that Delgado himself now described as false. Delgado looked at him without hostility. He said because someone finally opened a door. And I was done waiting to die on the other side of it. Stull tried to frame that as convenience. Self-preservation wearing the costume of conscience. In the defense table, Pruitt leaned forward and said the word traitor, not in a whisper. Low, but not in a whisper. The front row heard it. Naomi turned her gaze to him. A long, level, unhurried look. Not angry. Not surprised. Calibrated. The look of a woman who was building a record and had just been given another entry. She said nothing, not yet. She turned back to the stand. She said continue. Dr. Sandra Holm had been a practicing emergency physician for 31 years. She had seen every variation of physical trauma that a human body could sustain, had documented them, had explained them to families and to courts, and had developed the particular kind of composure that comes not from absence of feeling, but from a long professional relationship with terrible things. She took the stand in a gray blazer with her reading glasses on a gold chain and a binder thick with records. Morrow walked her through Darius Okafor's injuries methodically. Fractured 4th and 5th ribs on the right side. Fractured right wrist consistent with an impact against a hard surface while the wrist was extended. Dislocated left shoulder. Deep contusions along the left jaw and cheekbone. Bruising across the torso in a pattern consistent not with a fall, not with a brief struggle, but with repeated impact applied over a period of time applied after the subject was no longer capable of resistance. The gallery was very quiet. Morrow asked whether the injuries were consistent with the use of reasonable force by a police officer attempting to restrain a resisting suspect. Dr. Holmes said no. Morrow asked whether they were consistent with repeated force applied after the subject had gone to the ground. Dr. Holmes said yes. Morrow asked what Darius had said when he arrived at the emergency room. Dr. Holmes opened her binder to a specific page. She looked at it. Then she looked up. She said he asked whether his mother had been called. He asked it 4 times before he lost consciousness. He was disoriented and in significant pain and frightened, but the question was consistent. He asked it each time he had a moment of clarity, whether someone had called his mother. In the front row, Loretta Okafor pressed both hands over her mouth. The woman beside her put an arm around her shoulders. The gesture was quiet and small, but the room felt it. The room felt it the way a room feels a truth that has finally been said out loud. Stull cross-examined carefully. He asked whether injuries could occur during a physical struggle. They could. He asked whether adrenaline might make a suspect unpredictable. It might. He asked whether Dr. Holmes had been present at the scene of the arrest. She had not. Then Morrow stood for redirect. She asked Dr. Holmes a single question. Doctor, in your medical opinion, how many separate applications of force would be required to produce the combined injury pattern you have described? Dr. Holmes did not check her notes. She said not fewer than 6. Stull sat. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. At the defense table, Pruitt turned to his attorney and said through barely parted lips, "Do something." Stull did not look at him. He said very quietly, "You already made it worse." Pruitt stared at the side of his attorney's face. Then he looked at the bench, then at Naomi. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Not yet. Calculation. The expression of a man who has begun to reorganize internally, who is trying to find the angle. Naomi saw it. She had seen that expression before in rooms far smaller and far more dangerous than this one. She had been told by a commanding officer in the field that it was not the men who shouted who required the most attention. It was the men who went quiet. She quietly instructed the bailiff to remain at close attention near the defense table. Loretta Okafor took the stand after a brief recess. She walked to the witness chair the way she walked into her church on Sunday mornings, with her back straight and her pace unhurried, and her expression carrying the settled dignity of a woman who has decided that no room will ever make her small. Morrow asked her gently to tell the court about her son. Loretta set her hands flat on the railing in front of her. She said Darius was her only child. She said his father left when Darius was 7, and she had made a decision at that moment, standing in the kitchen after the car pulled away, that everything from that point forward was going to be for her son. Every shift, every sacrifice, every morning before the sun came up, and every night after it went down. She talked about Darius as a boy, how he took apart everything in the house trying to understand how it worked. The fan in the bathroom, the old radio on the kitchen shelf, her toaster which he had disassembled so thoroughly that it had taken her husband's brother 2 weekends to put it back together. A few people in the gallery smiled, the soft, painful kind of smile that comes from recognizing something ordinary in the middle of something terrible. Morrow asked what happened the night she received the call. Loretta's eyes dropped to her gloves. She said she had been in the kitchen. She said she could not sleep most nights when Darius was working late. She just needed to hear his key in the door. That sound, the specific sound of her son coming home. She said her phone rang close to midnight, a hospital number she did not recognize, and she said that when a hospital calls you at midnight and starts with the words, "We need you to come in," your body knows before your mind does. Something in your chest knows. She said she had driven there in her house slippers. She had not noticed until she was standing in the parking lot looking down at her feet. When she walked into the trauma bay, a nurse met her at the door and prepared her. They always prepared you. It never prepared you. Loretta said she had walked into the room and looked at her son, and for one terrible moment, 1 second that she would carry in her body for the rest of her life, she did not recognize him. She said she knew that sounded like something people said for effect. She said it was not for effect. She said when you have known someone's face since the first second of their life, since the moment they came into the world and looked at you, and you looked at them, and you walk into a room and you look at that person, and you do not know them, something breaks inside you that does not fully repair itself. The room was completely still. Loretta continued. She said Darius had been apologizing when she walked in. She said he was lying in that bed with 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist and a face that was barely recognizable, and he was apologizing to her. He was saying, "Mama, I'm sorry. I didn't do anything." She said she had pressed his hand and told him to be quiet. She said she had told him he had nothing to be sorry for. She said he kept saying it anyway, over and over, in between losing consciousness and coming back. She said that was the hardest part. Not the injuries, not the surgery 3 days later, not the months of recovery. The apology. A young man who had done nothing wrong lying broken in a hospital bed apologizing for it. The room held that in silence for a long moment. Stull rose for cross. He was careful. He was aware that the gallery was watching him with a particular quality of attention, the kind that comes when a room has decided that a thing is wrong and is waiting to see how the person on the wrong side of it handles the next few minutes. He established that she had not been present at the traffic stop. She agreed. He said that therefore she could not speak to what happened. Loretta looked at him steadily with the patience of a woman who had been explaining things to people who were not listening for most of her life. She said she was not there to speak to what happened. She was there to speak to what remained. She talked about Darius after. He no longer drove after dark if he could avoid it. He flinched at the sound of sirens in a way he had not done before. He had lost his nursing program placement. He sat by the window at night and watched the street below with the vigilance of someone waiting for something they hoped would not come. She said Darius used to talk about the kind of nurse he wanted to be. He wanted to work in pediatric oncology. He had said once, "Mama, those families need someone who isn't afraid to sit in the hard places with them." She said now he talked about leaving the state. Stull had no further questions. He sat down and looked at his papers, and they did not rearrange themselves into anything useful. At the defense table, Pruitt made a sound, low, dismissive, the sound a man makes when he has decided the entire room is performing for an audience that does not understand reality. Naomi did not look at him, but the court reporter's fingers kept moving, and the cameras kept recording, and the room kept its accounting. Sergeant Ray Boucher of Internal Affairs had the face of a man who had been disappointed by institutions for a very long time and had arrived somewhere in his late 50s at a kind of cold, functional fury that had replaced what had once been ordinary frustration. 27 years in Internal Affairs. He had seen everything. He had filed more complaints, written more recommendations, and watched more of both disappear than he could count without a file in front of him. He took the stand and set a binder the thickness of a telephone book on the railing. He opened it to the first marked tab. He looked at Pruitt briefly. Pruitt looked back at him with the cold attention of a man who has known for years that another man wanted to do exactly what that man is doing right now. Morrow asked him to summarize the complaint history for Officer Wade Pruitt over 18 years of service. Boucher began reading. Not dramatically. He read the way you read a damage assessment after a flood. Flat. Matter of fact. Heavy with what was behind the words. Excessive force, 2009. Dismissed. Racial harassment, 2010. Dismissed. Unlawful stop and search, 2011. Dismissed. Complainant intimidation, 2012. Dismissed. He continued through 14 entries before Stull rose with an objection about cumulative prejudice. Naomi overruled it without looking up from the notes she was making. She said the pattern of conduct was central to the case and the court would hear the full record. Boucher continued. The number 38, when it finally arrived at the end of the recitation, did not land with the force of a dramatic revelation. It landed the way large truths often land, not with a gasp, but with silence. A silence that meant the room understood that 38 was not a statistic. 38 was a decision, made again and again over 18 years. The decision that a pattern of harm was acceptable, that the people on the receiving end of it were acceptable losses, that the word dismissed was not a conclusion but a policy. Morrow asked how many of those 38 complaints resulted in any disciplinary action. Boucher looked up from the binder. None. The single word dropped into the room and settled at the bottom of it. She asked how many times Boucher had personally recommended disciplinary action against Officer Pruitt. 7 times. She asked what happened to those recommendations. Boucher's jaw tightened. He said 4 were returned marked unsubstantiated by Captain Gerald Thorne, who was Pruitt's supervising commander for 11 of the 18 years. He said 2 were sent back for revision, and the findings were changed before they were re-entered. He said 1 disappeared from the file entirely, and he found a scanned copy in an archive system 14 months ago which was included in the binder. The words disappeared from the file moved through the gallery. Morrow asked whether there had been additional informal complaints reports from people who had come in but not filed formally. Boucher said yes, many more. People who came in and then left before signing anything. She asked why. Boucher's expression did something. Not anger exactly, not quite sadness, something on the far side of both. He said because they were afraid of patrol cars appearing outside their homes after they filed, afraid of their sons and daughters being stopped more frequently, afraid of tickets, afraid of the particular kind of retaliation that looks exactly like normal police work if you don't know what you're looking for. He said people stopped filing because they understood what happened to the people who filed. At the defense table, Pruitt stood up. He did not wait to be addressed. He pushed back from the table and stood and said that was a lie. He said Boucher had been trying to end his career for years and had never found a single substantiated thing because there was nothing to find. Naomi said his name once quietly. He said the complaints were filed by people with agendas, people who resented being held accountable for their own behavior, people who had decided a black cop or a liberal judge was going to hand them what they wanted if they made enough noise. Naomi said his name again, same tone, same volume, same precise, untroubled clarity. He looked at her. She held his gaze. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, sit down." He sat, slowly, making sure the room understood he was sitting because he chose to. The court reporter had not stopped moving her hands. The cameras had not stopped recording. The room had not stopped watching. The following morning, the courtroom filled faster than it had on either of the previous 2 days. The story had made the evening news in Atlanta. It had made the wire services. A journalist who covered civil rights cases for a national publication had driven down from D.C. and was seated in the second row with a notebook and an expression of focused attention. Naomi arrived early. She sat in her chambers and she drank her coffee and she read through her notes one final time. She thought about what the day would hold. She thought about Darius Okafor and the dashcam audio that Morrow was about to present. She thought about the 38 complaints. She thought about the woman who had driven to the Internal Affairs office 3 times and left without signing anything. She put down her coffee. She put on her robe. She went to the room. Morrow announced that the state was prepared to present Exhibit 14. She described it as audio recovered from the dash cam mounted in Officer Delgado's patrol vehicle on the night of March the 22nd. She noted that it had been authenticated by the department's own forensic unit and independently verified by a private lab. Stull renewed his objection about chain of custody. Naomi addressed each element of the objection in turn, found none of them substantively supported by the record, and overruled. She turned to the gallery. She said she expected complete quiet. No outbursts, no movement, no commentary of any kind. She said this was evidence and it would be treated as evidence. The room settled. Pruitt was rigid at the defense table. His hands were folded in front of him. The knuckles had gone pale. Stull leaned close and said something very low. Pruitt's mouth moved in response, just barely. Naomi nodded to the clerk. The audio began with wind and the sound of tires on wet pavement, a car door opening, the soft static of a microphone adjusting to outdoor air. Then Darius Okafor's voice, young, tense, carefully, deliberately polite in a way that suggested he understood exactly what kind of moment he was in and was managing himself accordingly. He asked what he had done wrong. Then Pruitt's voice, sharper, closer to the microphone, a different texture entirely. He told Darius to step out of the car. Darius said, "Yes, sir." He was stepping out. His hands were where the officer could see them. Movement, the sound of shoes on wet pavement, fabric. Then Darius's voice again. He said he was not resisting. The first impact came through the speakers as a low, heavy crack. In the front row, Loretta Okafor covered her mouth with both hands. Darius, seated beside her, stared at a fixed point somewhere beyond the walls of the room. His jaw was tight. His hands were in his lap. Still. The second impact. And then Darius's voice, not dramatic, not performed, just human, just real. The voice of a 24-year-old man on wet pavement in the dark. He said, "Please stop." He said he did not do anything. Then Pruitt's voice, low, cold, the voice of a man who was entirely comfortable with what he was doing. He said, "You people always say that." The room contracted around those 4 words. The recording continued. Darius said he was just trying to go home. Pruitt's voice dropped lower. He said this was his street. He said Darius did not move there unless Pruitt allowed it. Another impact. Another sound from Darius that was not dramatic and was not performed, and was exactly as terrible as it was because it was real. Then Pruitt said the sentence that changed the air in the room permanently. He said, "You people do not learn unless it hurts." The audio clicked and crackled and went silent. No one in the gallery moved. Loretta Okafor was crying quietly, not dramatically. The way a person cries when they have been expecting the worst confirmation for a very long time, and the confirmation arrives, and it is exactly as bad as they knew it would be. Naomi let the silence hold. 10 full seconds. She had learned this in JAG in rooms where truth arrived after a long journey and needed space to settle before anyone touched it. She said, "The state may proceed." Stull stood slowly. He had the gray, hollow look of a man who had arrived at a trial expecting to mount a defense and discovered on the 3rd day that he had been building it on nothing. He challenged the recording on technical grounds. Naomi addressed each challenge without impatience and without warmth. She ruled the exhibit admitted in full. Pruitt said through tight teeth that recording did not show what it was like out there. Naomi turned to him. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, this court has given you significant latitude." She said that latitude was now exhausted. She said the next time he spoke without being addressed, she would have him removed from the room. He looked at her, the same look. The same slow assessment. But something had changed in it. The certainty had developed a hairline fracture. He looked away first. What happened in the next 15 minutes happened the way the most important things often happen. Not with ceremony, not with announcement. Piece by piece in the ordinary course of proceedings that had been going on for 3 days, the last structure beneath Pruitt's certainty gave way. Morrow said the state rested. 2 words. Quiet. Final. Naomi looked at the defense table. She said, "Mr. Stull, you may present your defense." Pruitt was already moving. Not standing. Not speaking. just shifting. The particular quality of movement that belongs to a person who has decided something and is beginning to act on it before they have fully decided. He said loud enough for the entire gallery to hear that the court had already decided. All of them. The judge, the prosecutor, the gallery. They had all decided before a single word was spoken. Naomi said his name. He said he could see it. In the way the room was arranged against him, in the way justice had been performing itself in his direction since day one. Naomi said this court had made no finding. He said she had made it with her face. The gallery went still in a different way than it had gone still before. This was the stillness of people watching someone cross a line they cannot uncross. Naomi did not look away from him. She said the court proceeded on evidence, not on the defendant's perception of expressions. Pruitt pushed back from the table. Stoll said Vance sit down. Pruitt did not sit down. He stood and he pointed at Naomi Carter, and he said that she sat up there like she understood what he dealt with. He said she had never been on a street at 2 a.m. She had never made a decision with her hands shaking and her heart in her throat, and nothing but instinct between her and something she could not see. He said she did not know what it cost to keep people like her safe. The phrase landed. The gallery heard it land. The court reporter recorded it. The cameras caught it. Naomi did not move. She had heard the phrase before, not in those exact words, but the architecture beneath it was familiar to her. The assumption that safety was something a woman like her received but could not provide. The assumption that gratitude was the appropriate posture. She said, Mr. Pruitt, this court is giving you one final opportunity to return to your seat. He said, or what? Stoll grabbed his arm. Pruitt turned and shoved him hard. Frank Stoll stumbled backward into the defense table and caught himself with both hands, papers scattering across the surface and onto the floor. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Pruitt turned back to the bench. He reached for the water cup at the edge of the defense table. He did not hesitate. He threw it. The water crossed the room and struck Naomi Carter across the face and the front of her robe. Someone screamed. Naomi did not flinch. Water ran down her face, down the front of her robe. She kept both hands flat on the surface of the bench. She kept her eyes on him. She said, "This is your final instruction." He was already moving. He crossed the space between the defense table and the bench in 4 steps. The bailiff positioned near the gallery entrance was moving. But Pruitt had the advantage of decision. He had decided before anyone else in the room what he was going to do. He grabbed the front of Naomi's robe with both hands. The fabric resisted for 1 second and then tore down the front with a sound that was sharp and ugly and unmistakable. The sound of something symbolic being destroyed by someone who did not understand the symbol. People were on their feet in the gallery. Voices erupted. The court reporter pushed back from her machine. Pruitt dragged Naomi forward from behind the bench. She was pulled into the open space beside the table, the torn robe falling away from her shoulders. The bailiff was coming. 8 feet, 6 feet. Pruitt raised his fist. He struck her. Her head snapped sideways. The edge of the table caught her shoulder and her side as she lost balance. She went to one knee. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of her lip. The gallery erupted with sound. Pruitt stood over her, breathing hard. His fist still clenched his chest, rising and falling with the effort and the adrenaline and 18 years of believing that force was the final answer to everything. He said something low and dark about how she did not get to stand above him, and then he reached for her again. That was the mistake, because Naomi Carter was not defeated. She was on one knee and she was bleeding and her robe was torn, and the room around her was in chaos, and none of that was the same as being defeated. 8 years in the JAG Corps, combat zone deployment, military self-defense training updated and recertified every 2 years throughout her service. She had been hit before, not in a courtroom, in circumstances where being hit and staying down was not something the mission allowed. She had been trained to absorb impact and keep thinking, to read a body's next movement before the muscles made it. Pruitt reached for her. She moved. not backward, into him. Inside his reach where his size and his strength gave him nothing, where the physics of the situation belonged to the person who knew how to use them. She controlled his wrist. She used his momentum, the forward weight of a man who had spent 18 years believing that size was the definitive answer, and she turned it against him. 3 seconds, perhaps less. Wade Pruitt hit the floor of Courtroom 7B on his face with a sound that echoed off the high ceiling and the polished walls and into the memory of every person in that room. The bailiff arrived within a second and pinned him down. A second officer came through the side door. Pruitt's arms were secured behind him. He struggled once. His body understood before his mind did that the struggle was over. The gallery had gone completely silent, not the silence of shock. The silence of witnessing. The silence that belongs to people who are watching something they will carry in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Naomi stood, not quickly, not with drama. She stood the way she had done everything in that room, with steadiness, with intention, as if falling had been a temporary interruption rather than a conclusion. The torn robe hung from her shoulders. The blood at the corner of her lip was visible. Her hands were steady. She looked down at Wade. Pruitt, restrained on the floor of his own catastrophe, face against the wood, breathing hard into the surface that would not give him anything back. She said, "You are not the law. You are a man who broke it." He said something rough and ragged about this not being over. She looked at him. She said, "No, Mr. Pruitt, it is just beginning." The deputies began to move him toward the side exit. He struggled once more. A sound came out of him that was raw and stripped of every layer he had walked in with that morning. The door opened. The deputies moved him through. The door closed behind him, and the sound of it was final. Naomi moved back to the bench. She adjusted what remained of her robe with careful, precise movements. She did not look at the gallery. She did not ask for anything from the room. She looked at the clerk, and she said, "Preserve all courtroom video immediately. Notify courthouse administration. Notify state police. No copy leaves this building without court authorization." She looked at the ADA. She said the record will reflect that the defendant attacked the presiding judge during open proceedings. This court is in recess pending security assessment. She stepped down from the bench. She walked through the gallery. As she passed the front row, Darius Okafor said her name. Quietly. She stopped. She looked at him. He had not been there on the first day, but he had come. He was wearing a dark suit. His shoulder was stiff under the jacket. The scar beneath his eye caught the overhead light. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Do not thank me for doing what the law requires, Mr. Okafor." Then she walked through the side door, and behind her courtroom 7B began the slow, irreversible work of becoming something different from what it had been. The side door closed. Naomi stood alone in the corridor for exactly 4 minutes. She set her back against the wall. She placed her hands flat on her thighs. She looked at them. They were trembling, finely. The kind of tremor that most people would not notice from a distance. She noticed. She watched her hands. She breathed. She gave herself the 4 minutes. Then she pushed off the wall. She walked to her chambers. She closed the door. She looked in the mirror above the wash basin. The blood at the corner of her lip had dried. The bruise on her cheek was beginning to develop its true color. Her robe was beyond repair. She took it off. She folded it carefully. She set it on the corner of her desk. She put on her spare. She stood at her desk with both palms flat on the surface. She looked at the manila folder. Pruitt's complaint file, 38 entries, 18 years. She thought about the woman who had come to internal affairs 3 times and left without signing anything. She thought about the teenager's mother who was told on the phone to let it go. She thought about a 24-year-old nursing student asking whether his mother had been called, asking it 4 times before he lost consciousness. She picked up her pen. She opened her legal pad. She began writing. By 4 in the afternoon, every television station in Georgia had a van parked outside the courthouse steps. The footage had leaked before Naomi's seal order reached administration. A gallery witness had captured the last 30 seconds on a phone camera. By the time the courthouse feeds were secured, the clip was already on multiple news sites and moving through social media. It showed Pruitt in full dress uniform. It showed the water. It showed the torn robe. It showed the strike and her going to one knee. And then it showed Naomi Carter standing back up. The image that every station chose to run was not the moment of the attack. It was the moment after. Naomi Carter standing in a torn robe with blood at her lip, her hands steady, her posture unbroken, looking at the courtroom camera as if she had always known it was there, because she had. The Keller County Police Department issued a statement at 4:45. Deputy Chief Raymond Yates read it from a podium at department headquarters. He called Pruitt's conduct an isolated emotional breakdown. He said it did not reflect the values of the department. He used the phrase, "one individual 3 times. In a conference room at the courthouse, Claire Morrow watched the statement with 2 federal investigators and senior prosecutor Karen Whitmore. When Yates used the phrase, "one individual for the 3rd time," Morrow turned off the television. Whitmore leaned back in her chair. She said they are not protecting him. They are cutting him loose and hoping he takes the file with him when he goes down. Morrow said there was always more when a department moved that fast. Whitmore said she knew. She said she had been doing these cases for 30 years, and the speed of the press conference was always proportional to the depth of the exposure. She said they needed to move on Captain Gerald Thorne before he had time to organize his own version of events. Federal investigators arrived at Captain Thorne's home at 7:15 that evening. They were polite. They asked him to come in voluntarily. He came in. He brought a personal attorney. After 12 minutes reviewing the preliminary evidence, the attorney asked for a break. During the break, he advised his client to consider cooperation very carefully. Thorne resigned the following morning. It made no difference. The resignation was noted and filed, and the investigation continued without pausing. Frank Stull withdrew as counsel on the same day. He filed the motion without elaboration. Howard Mills, Pruitt's new public defender, reviewed the evidence file in a single afternoon, and then walked into the detention facility and told his new client the truth. He said the original charges had a dashcam recording 2 credible witnesses' medical testimony from a veteran emergency physician and an internal affairs record that documented 18 years of unaddressed behavior. He said the additional charges had been recorded from 4 angles at full courthouse resolution with audio. He said federal prosecutors had entered the case with a pattern of conduct filing that tied the traffic stop to the full documented history. He said Pruitt could take it to trial. He said he had handled difficult cases before. He said this was not a difficult case. He paused. He said this was a concluded one. He said the only remaining question was whether Pruitt wanted to spend the next year watching it finish in a courtroom, or whether he wanted to walk into that room one final time and end it. Pruitt sat across from him in the gray institutional light of the meeting room. Without the uniform, without the badge, without the belt and the shoes and the posture that 18 years of impunity had built into his body. He looked smaller, not physically, just less certain of the room. He said he needed to think about it. Mills said he had until Monday. The guilty plea was entered on a Thursday morning in late November. There was no speech, no looking at the gallery, no looking at Darius Okafor or at the seat where Naomi Carter would have been had she been there. She was not. She had recused herself from the plea proceedings as a matter of course. Pruitt stood at the defense table and said the word guilty, to all counts. The room received it without celebration and without applause, with the quiet, particular relief of people who have been waiting for a specific thing for a long time and are still adjusting to the reality of its arrival. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later. Federal Judge Constance Avery presided. She had been on the bench for 19 years and had the reputation of someone who read every document in a file and forgot nothing she had read. She had read Pruitt's file, all of it. The victim's statements came first. Darius Okafor walked to the podium. His shoulder was still stiff and the scar beneath his eye was visible under the courtroom lights. But he walked straight and he stood straight, and he looked at the room with the clear eyes of someone who has decided that fear will not be the last word. He said that for a long time after March 22nd, he believed Pruitt had taken something from him that would not come back. He stopped sleeping normally. He stopped trusting the sound of tires behind him on a quiet street. His mother had gone back to waiting by the window the way she did when he was small. He looked at his mother. She pressed the corners of her eyes with 2 fingers. He said he had understood something since then. He said Pruitt was never powerful. He was protected, and protection eventually ran out. He said standing up did not mean you were not afraid. Sometimes it meant you were afraid and you stood up anyway. He stepped back from the podium, and his mother reached for his hand. Naomi Carter came next. She was not wearing her robe. She wore a charcoal suit and small pearls at her collar. The bruise on her cheek was long gone, but everyone in the room remembered it. She said that when Pruitt attacked her, he revealed the logic by which he had lived. He believed authority belonged to whoever was willing to cause the most fear. He believed a badge could turn cruelty into duty. She said what happened to her lasted seconds. What happened to Darius Okafor lasted months and would last longer. What happened to 38 other people whose complaints were buried had lasted years. She said the greater injury was not the torn robe. The greater injury was the long practice of making citizens believe that the law would not hear them. She said justice was not revenge. Justice was responsibility arriving after a delay. She asked the court to impose a sentence that spoke from truth. She stepped back. Judge Avery was silent for a moment. She removed her glasses. She looked at Pruitt. He was looking at the surface of the table. She told him he had been given power by the public. He had been trusted with a badge and a weapon, and the authority to enter the lives of citizens at their most vulnerable. He had used that trust to punish and to silence and to degrade. She said that when accountability finally arrived, he had not responded with remorse. He had responded with violence, in a courtroom, on camera, in front of witnesses. She lifted the sentencing order. She said on the federal counts the sentence was 22 years. On the state convictions to be served consecutively 18 years. 40 years. The number moved through the room like a wave. Pruitt looked up from the table. He looked at the 40 years the way a man looks at a wall he has just run into and cannot go around. Avery held his gaze. She said the sentence reflected not only what he had done to Darius Okafor, but what he had taught an entire community to fear, and what it had cost them to learn that the fear was not inevitable. The gavel came down. The marshals moved in. Pruitt looked around the room. The officers who had come in uniform on the first day were not there. His attorney was not there. No one who had ever stood on his side of anything was in that room. The old wall was gone. The marshals took him by the arms, and he did not resist. He walked toward the side door. He paused at the threshold. He looked back once at the room. Then the door closed behind him, and the sound of it was final. Captain Gerald Thorne was indicted 6 weeks later. 4 counts of obstruction, 1 count of civil rights conspiracy. He retained an attorney, and both their names appeared in the newspapers alongside the word indicted, which is the kind of word that attaches to a name and does not let go. The union declined to fund any further defenses. The press release was careful and brief. Darius Okafor received a letter from his nursing program director 2 days after the sentencing. It acknowledged the expungement of the planted charge. It acknowledged the program's failure to protect him. It reinstated his placement effective immediately and credited his prior hours in full. The director had added a handwritten note at the bottom. It said, "We are glad you are still here." Darius read it at his kitchen table. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept important things. He called his mother. She cried. Then she laughed at herself for crying. Then she asked what he wanted for dinner. He said, "Whatever you make." He drove to her house. They sat at the same table where she had been making chamomile tea on the night her phone rang. They ate without saying much. They did not need to say much. The quiet between them had a different quality now. It was not the quiet of waiting. It was the quiet of people who have come through something together and are still improbably here. If this story reached you, we hope you will subscribe to our channel, where stories like this one find the audience they deserve. Stories about people who refused to be erased, about institutions that failed and were finally held to account, about the long, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful arrival of something that looks like justice. Wade Pruitt was transferred to a federal correctional facility in eastern Tennessee 90 days after sentencing. He was placed in protective custody, housed away from general population, which was standard practice for former law enforcement. He was assigned a work detail. He swept a long corridor every morning at 6. The corridor had no windows and fluorescent lights that never changed, and a floor that showed him nothing back. He was inmate 11407. He had 40 years. On his first morning, he walked the length of the corridor with the broom in his hands, and he thought about the courtroom. He thought about the bench. He thought about reaching for her, and the moment she moved, how fast she moved, how the floor came up to meet him before he understood what was happening. He had spent 18 years believing that power was something you carried in your body, in your badge, in your voice, in the certainty that the room would arrange itself around you. He had been wrong. He reached the end of the corridor. He turned. He started back, and across the state, in a courthouse that was ordinary and unremarkable in every external way, a woman in a clean robe took her seat behind a polished oak bench and looked at the courtroom camera in the upper right corner, the one that Pruitt had never thought to fear, and then she looked away from it. The clerk entered. "Ready, Your Honor." Naomi Carter set her hands on the surface of the bench. "Yes," she said, "let's begin." The doors of courtroom 7B opened, not as a place where a man had believed that violence was authority, not as a place where impunity had been permitted to wear a badge for 18 years, but as a place where the law, bruised and unbroken, had stood its ground, where truth had finally been given a room with enough light, and where a woman had gotten up off the floor in a torn robe with blood at her lip and refused to be the end of the story. There is something that happens to a community when it finally sees itself confirmed, not celebrated, not vindicated in the way people describe victory in movies with music and applause and a clean feeling of resolution, just confirmed. The feeling that what you knew was real, what you believed was happening, what you whispered about in church halls and kitchen tables and backyard conversations on warm evenings was real, was documented, was on a camera, was in a federal file, was stated under oath by a man who had finally decided that loyalty to a system was not worth the weight of what he had helped that system do. Keller County did not celebrate the verdict the way an outside observer might have expected. The people who had lived under the particular kind of pressure that Wade Pruitt represented did not pour into the streets. They went home. They sat with their families. Some of them called people they had not spoken to in a while, people who had filed complaints years ago and had their lives made difficult in ways that were impossible to prove, and they said they finally got him. Those 3 words. They finally got him. Not "we won." Not "justice is served." Because the people who had lived through it understood that 40 years in a federal facility did not give back the years that had been taken. The complaint that was dismissed did not undismiss itself. The woman who had withdrawn her report because of the patrol cars outside her house had not become unafraid. What the verdict gave them was confirmation. And confirmation after years of being told that what you knew was wrong, that what you felt was an overreaction, that the institution was trustworthy, and the people questioning it were not confirmation was not nothing. It was a great deal. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, the federal investigation moved outward, the way federal investigations do when they find a center and begin following the threads. Captain Gerald Thorne cooperated partially. His attorney advised cooperation, and he complied to a degree, which is to say, he gave the investigators what he calculated would satisfy them, without giving them what would bury him completely. The investigators were not satisfied with partial. They found the emails. There are always emails. Even men who believe they are careful about what they put in writing tend under the particular pressure of routine to put things in writing. Thorne had sent 4 emails over a 3-year period to the deputy chief above him. Emails that referenced Pruitt by name, that described certain complaints as manageable, that used a particular phrase twice, which was an officer who gets results in environments others consider too difficult. The phrase was entered into evidence. It became, in the federal complaint against Thorne, what lawyers call a governing document. A piece of writing that revealed the philosophy rather than just the action. That showed not merely that a specific complaint had been dismissed, but that the dismissal of specific complaints was understood by the people doing the dismissing to be a form of management, a deliberate choice. Thorne was charged with 4 counts of obstruction and 1 count of civil rights conspiracy. He accepted a plea agreement that gave him 6 years and stripped him of his pension and his certification and his ability to work in any law enforcement or supervisory capacity for the rest of his life. He made a statement at his sentencing. He said he had thought he was protecting the department. He said he understood now that he had been protecting one man's ability to harm people. The judge at his sentencing said she appreciated the statement and noted that understanding the difference between those two things was something he should have arrived at many years earlier. Darius Okafor returned to his nursing program in January. He walked back into the building on a Monday morning. His student ID reinstated his locker, restored his clinical hours, credited in full. His program director met him at the entrance. She was a woman in her late 50s named Dr. Patricia Webb, who had been in nursing administration for 22 years and had the practical, unsentimental manner of someone who had spent a career focused on outcomes rather than performance. She shook his hand. She said she was glad he was back. She said the program had failed him, and she intended to make sure it did not fail anyone else the same way. Darius thanked her. He went to his locker. He hung up his jacket. He put on his scrubs. He went to his first clinical of the semester. It was a pediatric ward on the 4th floor. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something warmer underneath it, something that had to do with the proximity of families who were living in a hospital, because the alternative was unthinkable. He stood at the nursing station for a moment before the shift began. He thought about the night in March. He thought about the pavement. He thought about his mother driving to the hospital in her house slippers. He thought about the 4 times he had asked whether she had been called. He thought about what it meant to be here, to have come back to this hallway, this ward, this life that he had been building before one man's decision tried to take it from him. He thought about the families on the other side of those doors, the ones who needed someone who was not afraid to sit in the hard places with them. He picked up his patient chart. He went to work. In the months that followed, several things happened that did not make the evening news but were noted by the people they affected. The woman who had withdrawn her complaint 3 years earlier, the one who had been afraid of the patrol cars outside her house, reached out to an attorney who had been following the Pruitt case. She refiled. Her case was reviewed as part of the broader federal pattern investigation. Her complaint became part of a civil settlement that the city of Keller County reached with 15 individuals identified as victims of documented misconduct during Pruitt's tenure. The settlement did not undo what had happened to any of them. It acknowledged it, which was, for most of them, the first time an institution had acknowledged it in writing with a number attached. The Internal Affairs Unit at Keller County PD was restructured. A new oversight board was established, including 3 civilian members appointed by the county commission. Sergeant Ray Boucher, who had spent 27 years watching complaints disappear, was appointed as the interim director of the unit with a mandate to rebuild the filing and review process from the foundation. He accepted on the condition that he could hire his own staff. They said yes. He started on a Monday. The first thing he did was go through the archived files and count every complaint that had been returned for revision in the past 15 years. There were more than he had expected. He began making a list. Naomi Carter resumed her full docket 2 weeks after the sentencing. She went back to the work of the courtroom, which was the ordinary, unglamorous, essential work of a place where people brought their arguments and their grievances and their evidence and asked a woman in a robe to listen and decide. She presided over contract disputes, property cases, a custody matter that took 3 weeks and required every ounce of patience she had, a civil rights case involving housing discrimination that was less dramatic than the Pruitt proceedings, but no less important to the family sitting at the plaintiff's table. She did not give interviews. She received requests from multiple national publications and declined all of them. She said through her clerk that the case had been about the law, and the law did not need her to speak on its behalf. She worked her usual hours. She arrived early. She read everything. She made her decisions with the careful, deliberate attention that the people who came before her deserved. On the last day of February, a woman appeared in her courtroom for a property dispute that had been dragging on for 14 months. The woman was in her 70s. She was fighting over a strip of land between her property and her neighbor's that was 11 feet wide, and that she said had belonged to her family for 3 generations. The dispute was documented. The evidence was clear. Naomi ruled in her favor. The woman said, "Thank you." Naomi said, "You are welcome." That was the whole of it. After the session ended and the room had cleared, Naomi sat alone for a moment at the bench. She thought about the morning in October when she had arrived early and read through a file and felt the weight of 38 complaints against her palms. She thought about the water, the torn robe, the floor. She thought about getting up. She thought about what it had cost and what it had meant and whether the meaning was worth the cost, and she arrived at the conclusion she always arrived at when she sat with that question long enough. The question itself was wrong. Meaning was not purchased with cost. Meaning was what remained after the cost had been paid and you were still standing. She had done her job. In the hardest possible conditions, she had done exactly her job. She stood. She adjusted her robe. She walked through the side door. Tomorrow was another docket. There would be more cases. More people who needed someone to listen and decide without flinching. More work to do. She went home. She made dinner. She sat at her kitchen table and looked out the window at the evening coming down over the neighborhood, and she thought it was a good day to have done a necessary thing. Wade Pruitt marked his first year in federal custody on a Tuesday. He had been transferred twice since Eastern Tennessee. The second facility was in West Virginia, a different building, a different corridor, a different fluorescent light above a different broom. The work was the same. The hours were the same. The quiet was the same. He had 39 years remaining. He did not think often anymore about the courtroom. It had faded the way things fade when you have nothing to do but let them. What remained was not memory exactly. It was more like a shape. The shape of a morning when he had believed with complete certainty that the room was his, and the shape of the floor. He reached the end of the corridor. He turned around. Outside in a city he would not see for a very long time, a woman in a charcoal robe was taking her seat behind a polished oak bench. A clerk was calling a case. A court reporter was setting her hands above her machine. The work was continuing. The law, which does not require that we believe in it to be bound by it, which does not require our cooperation to operate, which proceeds with or without our understanding of its weight, was continuing. And in a nursing ward on the 4th floor of Keller Memorial Hospital, a young man in scrubs was walking through a door to sit with a family in a hard moment to be the person in the room who was not afraid to stay. He moved carefully because his shoulder was still stiff some mornings. He moved forward because he had decided somewhere in the long months between the pavement and this hallway that forward was the only direction that served anyone. His name was Darius Okafor. He was 25 years old. He had a scar beneath his eye and a healed fracture in his wrist and a mother who waited up until she heard his key in the door. He had been told by a man who no longer wore a badge that he did not belong where he was going. He walked through this door anyway. That is what courage looks like when it is not performing. That is what it looks like when a person who has been told to be small decides quietly and without ceremony to simply continue. The lesson of what happened in Courtroom 7B is not complicated. A man believed that the badge was permission. That authority meant he could harm people without consequence. That the institutions around him would continue as they had for 18 years. To absorb the complaints and reclassify the findings and return the recommendations and make it all disappear. He was right about the institutions, until he was not. The institutions failed. For a long time, and in documented ways they failed. And the people who bore the cost of that failure were not the people who ran the institutions. They were the people on the other side of the badge. The people who filed complaints and withdrew them in fear. The people who sat in hospital beds apologizing for being hurt. The people who stopped driving after dark and flinched at sirens and talked about leaving the state entirely. That is the real story. Not one officer, not one courtroom, but 18 years of institutional permission and what it costs the people who live inside that permission without being protected by it. What happened in October was not the beginning of accountability. It was the first time accountability was allowed to reach the surface. The first time a woman with the authority and the background and the refusal to be intimidated sat in the elevated chair and did not look away. Naomi Carter did not need to perform her strength. She did not need to make a speech or a symbol of herself. She needed to do her job. And when a man decided that her job was something he could take from her by force, she demonstrated with the clarity that only 3 seconds and the floor of a courtroom can provide that he was wrong. And the cameras recorded it, and the court reporter recorded it. And the dashcam recorded what happened to Darius Okafor on a wet street in March. And Sergeant Boucher kept his copies. And Officer Delgado finally walked through a door and told the truth. None of it was one moment. All of it was one story. And the story continues. It continues every morning when someone files a complaint and someone else decides whether to take it seriously. Every time a supervisor signs a report that they know is incomplete. Every time a person pulls over on a dark street and tries to calculate how afraid to be. Every time someone sits in an elevated chair and chooses or fails to choose to do the thing the law requires. This is not a story about one bad officer. This is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to stop one bad officer spend 18 years stepping aside instead. And about what becomes possible when they finally stop. If this story stayed with you, if it reached something in you that you recognize from your own life or from the lives of people you love, we hope you will subscribe to our channel where we tell stories like this one. Stories that do not look away. Stories about the people who paid the cost and the people who are still paying it. Stories about the long, imperfect, necessary work of making something that looks more like justice. The corridor in the federal facility is long. The fluorescent light does not change. The broom is just a broom. And inmate 11407 walks it every morning at 6. He reaches the end. He turns around. He has 39 years remaining to consider the distance between the man he thought he was and the man the floor of Courtroom 7B revealed him to be. It is a very long corridor, and there is nothing at the end of it that will look like the room belonged to him. Not anymore. Not ever again. There are things that do not appear in the trial record. They do not appear because trials are structured to receive specific kinds of evidence in specific kinds of formats. Testimony under oath, physical exhibits, audio and video recordings, medical reports, the documented history of institutions doing or failing to do what they were obligated to do. But there are things that do not fit into those formats. The way Loretta Okafor's hands shook when she drove to the hospital and she did not notice until she was standing in the parking lot looking down at her slippers. The way the word mama kept coming out of her son in between the moments of unconsciousness, as if that one word was the anchor his mind reached for when everything else was going dark. These things are not in the trial record, but they are part of what the trial was about. They are part of the full accounting. Loretta Okafor went back to her 2 jobs. She worked the early shift at the dry cleaner on Meridian Avenue and the afternoon shift at the school cafeteria 3 days a week. She had done this for 16 years. The difference now was that when she drove to work, she did not sit in the particular alertness she had developed over the years. The low-level watchfulness of a mother who knew her son drove the same roads and who had absorbed over the years enough stories from enough mothers to know that the roads were not equally dangerous for everyone. The watchfulness did not disappear entirely. It does not disappear. It settles into a different register. What changed was that she drove, knowing that when her son was stopped on a dark road by a man who believed his badge was permission, someone had finally made sure there was a record of what that permission cost. It was not peace exactly. It was something more realistic than peace. It was confirmation and a thin but real reason to believe that the next time someone tried to make it disappear, it might not disappear as easily as the 38 times before. She thought about that sometimes on the drive to Meridian Avenue, with the early morning light coming through the windshield and the radio playing low. She thought that her son was going to be a nurse, that he was going to sit with families in the hardest moments of their lives, that he had been through a hard moment himself and had decided instead of letting it make him smaller, to let it make him more precisely the person he had always been trying to be. She thought I raised that boy. Then she parked the car and went to work. At Keller Memorial Hospital, the 4th-floor pediatric ward had a particular rhythm to it. The night shift ended at 7 in the morning, and the day shift came on, and there was a brief overlap period where the outgoing nurses briefed the incoming ones on the status of each patient. Who had slept? Who had been awake? Who needed something adjusted? Who had a procedure scheduled? Who had family coming? Darius was on the day shift Tuesday through Saturday. He had a particular way of entering a patient room for the first time in the morning. He knocked even when the door was open. He introduced himself by name. He asked how the night had been before he asked anything about symptoms or medications. He had learned this from a supervising nurse named Claudette, who had been doing the job for 34 years and who said on his first day back that the medical part people figured out quickly. The human part was the thing that took longer and that some nurses never fully arrived at. She said she thought he would get there. He was getting there. There was a boy on the ward named Jordan. He was 7 years old. He had been admitted for a series of tests related to a condition his parents had been trying to understand for 2 years, and in the meantime, he was 7. and being 7 in a hospital ward had its own particular texture. He was bored. He was worried in the way that 7-year-olds are worried about things they do not fully understand, which is to say that the worry did not take the form of the specific fear his parents carried, but rather a general sense that things were not normal, and that not normal was something he needed to manage. Darius brought him a book on the 3rd day. A book about how bridges were built. Jordan was not specifically interested in bridges, but he was interested in anything that was not the ceiling of his hospital room, and the book had photographs that were large and specific, and showed in detail how the cables of a suspension bridge were anchored and tensioned, and how the whole thing stayed up under conditions that ought to bring it down. Jordan said he had not known that bridges worked that way. Darius said most people did not. He said there was a lot that looked like it should fall and didn't. Jordan thought about that. He said, "Is that what's happening to me?" Darius said he was not a doctor and could not tell him specifically about his condition. He said that was a question for his parents and the doctor. Jordan said, "But do you think it could be?" Darius looked at him for a moment. He said, "I think a lot of things that look like they might fall don't. I think that is true in general. I think there is usually more holding something up than you can see from the outside." Jordan considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who has had time to think. He said, "Okay." He went back to the bridges. The appeals process in the Pruitt case moved slowly the way appeals processes do. Stull was no longer involved. A different attorney filed on Pruitt's behalf, challenging several procedural decisions made during the hearings. None of the challenges succeeded. The torn robe remained in federal evidence storage, sealed in a clear bag with a case number on the label. On the day the final appeal was denied, a clerk in the evidence room pulled the bag from its shelf and confirmed its status in the system and returned it to the shelf. That was the whole of it. Naomi was in her courtroom when the appeals decision came through. Her clerk brought her a note during a recess. She read it. She folded it. She put it in her jacket pocket. She went back to the bench. She called the next case. She did her job. What does it mean when a system finally works? When the complaints are heard instead of buried? When the testimony reaches the surface? When the recording that was supposed to be silent turns out not to be? It does not mean the system is fixed. It does not mean the next person who stands in front of a badge will be safe the way the law intends them to be safe. It does not mean the 38 complaints were never dismissed, or that the woman who withdrew hers was never afraid. What it means is narrower and more specific than that. It means that in a specific courtroom on specific days in October, a specific woman in a robe applied the law to a specific man who had spent 18 years believing the law did not apply to him. And she did not look away. And when he tried to make her stop, she demonstrated that he could not. That is what it means. It is narrower than justice. It is what justice looks like at the ground level, one case at a time, in rooms that smell like wood polish and old paper, and the particular kind of institutional air that carries the weight of every proceeding that has ever taken place within those walls. It is the only kind of justice that is real, the only kind that happens, the dramatic kind, the kind that fixes everything all at once, the kind that arrives with a final music and a clean resolution. That kind only happens in stories. This is a story, but it is the kind that is built from things that actually happen, from the weight of 38 complaints, from the sound of a young man asking for his mother 4 times before he lost consciousness, from a sergeant who kept his copies, from an officer who finally walked through a door, from a woman who got up off the floor. The floor of Courtroom 7B has been polished since October. It reflects the overhead light cleanly. If you look at it from the right angle, you can see the elevated bench and the empty chair behind it, and the cameras in the upper corners watching the room the way they always have, waiting for the next case, waiting for the next person who needs the law to hear them, waiting for the next moment when the truth is given enough light and enough space to be recognized. The doors open. People take their seats. The clerk calls the case. The work continues. It always continues. That is the thing about justice, not the story kind, the real kind. It does not finish. It does not resolve into silence. It keeps walking forward imperfectly, slowly sometimes, with blood at its lip and a torn robe and both hands steady on the surface of the bench. But it keeps walking, and that is enough to keep going. That is enough. Spring came late to Keller County that year. March arrived cold and gray and stayed that way longer than usual, as if the season was reluctant to commit to something as ordinary as warmth after a winter that had held so much. Then one morning in the middle of the month, the light shifted. The kind of shift that happens between one day and the next, where one morning you get into your car and the air is cold and the sky is white, and the next morning the same drive feels like a different planet. Loretta Okafor noticed it on her way to work. She was driving down Meridian Avenue with the window cracked and the radio playing something she was not quite listening to, and she realized that the trees along the street had moved past the bare stage into something earlier, the tight green of buds that had not yet committed to becoming leaves. She thought it was the kind of thing you did not notice when you were watching for other things. When you were watching the road behind you and the patrol cars and the particular quality of headlights that appeared too close and too soon. She thought about how much looking she had done in the past year. Not just the months of the case, the years before it, the accumulated watching that happens when you are a mother and you understand that the world your son moves through is not the same world that moves around him. She rolled the window down a little more. The air was cold and clean and smelled like something that had been waiting. She thought, we are still here. It was not a triumphant thought. It was a quiet one. The kind that arrives when you have been through enough to know the difference between triumph and continuance, and you have decided that continuance is not the lesser of the two. We are still here, and the trees are budding, and my son is going to work this morning, and he is going to sit with a family in a hard moment, and he is not going to look away. She parked the car. She picked up her bag. She went to work. On a Tuesday in April, Darius Okafor took his nursing board licensing exam. He sat in a room with 31 other candidates. He had studied for 4 months. He had made index cards and sat with them at the kitchen table on the nights before his clinical shifts, memorizing dosages and protocols and the specific sequences of action that the difference between a good outcome and a terrible one could depend on. He had been nervous in the weeks leading up to it. Not the kind of nervous that paralyzes, the kind that sharpens. He sat down. He read the first question. He thought about a 7-year-old named Jordan who had asked him whether things that looked like they should fall sometimes didn't. He thought about what he had said. There's usually more holding something up than you can see from the outside. He took a breath. He began. The results arrived in the mail 14 days later. He was at his mother's house when they came. He had not planned to be there. He had stopped by after his shift because she had left a voicemail about leftovers, which was her language for "I want to see you," and he had learned over the years to translate correctly. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of food when the mail came through the slot in the front door. He got up. He walked to the hallway. He looked at the envelope. Loretta had come out of the kitchen and was standing in the doorway. She was drying her hands on a dish towel. She looked at the envelope. She did not say anything. He opened it. He read the single word that mattered. He read it again. He turned to his mother. He said, "I passed." She did not make a sound. She crossed the hallway and put both arms around him and held him the way she had held him in the hospital room in March of last year when he was hurt and afraid, and she needed him to know she was there. She held him the same way, but it was a different kind of moment. Not the same fear, not the same darkness, just her arms around him and the spring light coming through the window over the door and the smell of dinner from the kitchen and the simple enormous fact of continuance. We are still here. He is going to be a nurse. He passed. Naomi Carter walked into courtroom 7B on a morning in April and found a small photograph on her bench. She did not know immediately who had left it there. It was a photograph of a nursing school graduation recent informal taken on a phone camera in a hallway. A young man in a white coat, standing straight, looking at the camera with the clear expression of someone who has come through something and decided to keep going. There was a note on the back. It said, "Thank you for doing what the law requires." She recognized the phrase. She had said it to him in October, in the moment when he had thanked her as she passed through the gallery. She had said, "Do not thank me for doing what the law requires." He had sent the phrase back to her, with the photograph, with this evidence of what the law-making space for him had allowed. She stood at the bench for a long moment with the photograph in her hands. The court reporter came in. The clerk came in. The gallery began to fill. Naomi set the photograph on the inner edge of the bench where she could see it from her chair. She adjusted her robe. She sat down. She looked at the room. She looked at the people who had come in with their cases and their grievances and their evidence and their need for someone to listen and decide without flinching. She looked at the photograph. She thought this is what the law is for. Then she turned to the clerk. She said, "Call the first case." The work continued. It always continued. In the corridor of a federal facility in West Virginia, a man with a broom reached the end of a long hall and turned around. In a hospital on the 4th floor, a young man in scrubs knocked on a door and introduced himself by name and asked how the night had been. In a house on the south side of Keller County, a woman drove to work with the window cracked and the spring air coming in and thought, "We are still here." And in a courtroom that smelled like wood polish and institutional air and the particular weight of everything that had ever been decided within its walls, a woman in a robe looked at the room and did not look away. The doors opened. The case was called. And the law, which does not ask our permission to be the law, continued its slow, imperfect, necessary work. One room at a time, one case at a time, one moment at a time. That is how it works. That is the only way it works. And for the people who sat in those front rows and filed those complaints and drove to hospitals in the middle of the night and held their sons' hands and refused to be made small, that is enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough to keep walking forward. Enough to open the door. Enough to begin.